Hi, I'm teacher Arthur, and as you have done the 3 oral lessons prior to this will be the last of the oral lessons, and hopefully this will help you prepare for your O-level oral within the few next days. Okay, so as you remember, leisure, entertainment, education, culture, and this is the last one, public transport. So without further ado, let's go straight into the questions and see how we can unpackage it, as well as what you can do to prepare for oral examinations. So we straight jump into questions. Okay, first recommendation I will give to my students as well as all of you is that treat your oral questions like an essay question. For the very reason, if you know how to answer your essay questions, you know how to approach your oral questions. So let's look at question 1, where we talk about some people think cities only need to have public transport. What are your views? So one common thing I would say is that when we talk about views, you're talking about opinions, correct? So in an opinion, that means we require to take a stand. And hence, this can be considered a discursive essay. But in oral, we do not write discursive essays. Instead, we write argumentative. So if you're writing an argumentative, in oral, we present it as a scare answer. Can? So this will require a scare format, as we all know is written here. Your stand, counter, argument, rebuttal, and ending. By now, you should all be familiar and aware of how to use scare, but we will do scare again one last time for today's oral lesson. Okay, apart from that, second question is the same idea where private hire applications can replace taxis and buses. What do you think? Again, asking for an opinion. So we require a stand. It's not discursive, we make it argumentative, so we're going to use a scare format. Can so far? So last but not least, we can look at the question. How do you think Singapore's public transport systems could be better? So this is asking for an opinion as well, because we're asking you, how do you think it could be better? But you can also argue it that it's just asking for examples. So one method you can use is scare. You can say how it's good, bad, and could be better. Or you can answer it could be better because of examples 1, 2, and 3. So you could also use peel because it could present itself as expository. For the purposes of today's oral answer, we will present it as a scare. But at the end of the day, if you feel that it's more expository, you can write it as expository. Okay, so that is how we unpackage the questions. So you realize this is a really quick and fast method. So please make sure you do this within 5 seconds or less. You need to prepare as fast as possible, correct? So now let's look at question 1. Some people think cities only need public transport. So we will need to unpackage keywords. So let's start with public transport. What we define as public transport is transport, in my opinion, would be transport manned by the public sector or the government. So this will include MRTs or trains in Singapore, as well as buses. And some might say taxis such as SMRT taxis and whatnot. So these are all public transport. So if the question is asking only need public, the opposite argument should be private, correct? So private transportation comes in many forms and sizes. Why do I say sizes? Because you can actually go to the lowest, which is the bicycle. But you can go bigger, which is your private cars, where you can talk about personal cars such as the ones your family drives. Or you can talk about other cars such as Grab, Gojek, Tada, all those kind of applications. And last but not least, you can even consider buses that charter you from place to place, such as for learning journeys or excursions. Excuse me. Okay. So now we're going to talk about why do some people think so. So this is where we talk about the pros and cons. So bear in mind when we talk about pros and cons, pro of one is the con of the other. So in this case, you can just talk about pros of public and the pros of private. So let's start with public transport. Why is it a pro? First of all, it is cheap. As we all know, it is cheaper to take public transport than private transport, barring except the personal transport or the bicycle. So if you're comparing buses with maybe Grab or chartered bus, public will be cheaper. We can also argue that it is convenient. As we all know, the buses and trains in Singapore, especially Singapore's case, that's why cities is mentioned here. We can specifically talk about Singapore. We can talk about how they map around the whole country, and most roads have at least a bus running through them. So this is something we can consider as well. Last but not least, you can actually say why it is good is because of the big C, which is known as carbon emissions. So what I mean by this is that, as you all know, all transport systems that run on petrol will require to burn out carbon dioxide and worst case carbon monoxide, correct? So how do we equate this with why public transport is better? If you do the math behind it, correct, one person in one car maybe produce 1 kg of carbon dioxide. Whereas if you consider maybe 5 people in one car produce 2 kilograms, you can see that per person, this would be a lot better. That's why per person carbon emissions are lower. So that means buses would have lower carbon footprint. And we can actually tie this to an even bigger picture where we can talk about why this is important is because of the environment. Can? So as you all know, now global warming is a very key pertinent issue in the world. So we can argue that because of this issue, we would like more buses, more trains to prevent more carbon emissions and to keep the world cooler. So that's why some people believe that cities should only have buses. We can also argue that because it is convenient and in the city system is very interconnected, we don't really need cars and private vehicles for that matter. So that's why we can argue the idea of cities and the public transport pros. Okay. Now we're going to look at the private transportation pros instead. So the other argument is also convenient, interestingly enough. So what do you mean by convenient? So maybe we have multiple destinations or multiple trips. It is convenient to take a private transport because you have multiple trips, so you need to make frequent stops. And this makes it a bit more worthwhile to take private transport. You can also argue that instead of just multiple trips, you can argue the convenience of secluded areas. So in some areas, maybe it'll be a bit harder to reach. Let's say maybe the Woodlands Park near the checkpoint. That could be a very far off place that buses might not go to. So that, it's called the Woodlands Waterfront Park. Let's Google that. Woodlands Waterfront Park. Okay. So the Woodlands Waterfront Park, as you can see here, is at the edge of the country where buses might not necessarily go to. So you can argue that because of private transport, you are able to access this kind of locations. Okay? So you can argue it that way. So that's why secluded areas could benefit from private transport. Another big C we can consider is comfort. As you all know, we can take naps in both private and public, but in private, it's much more comfortable because you're in a car that you know and you can trust. Whereas in a public transport system, surely you've seen people, nodding off onto someone's shoulder, which is kind of awkward, especially since you might not know that person. Personally, I've been a culprit of that situation, so you know that very awkward vibe when you wake up and you're like, oh no, I just lean on this stranger, what do I say next? Worse is when someone starts snoring or drooling, and then you know that's a bit of a problem in a public setting. So this is something you can do. On top of that, you can also argue the comfort when it comes to conversations on transportations. So maybe you want to have a private conversation with your friends. It might make more sense to do it in a private setting than a public setting, especially when you think about it. People who talk on phones in trains are usually very disruptive and very annoying and very, very unsocial and unliked generally. So you can argue it that way also. That's why, private might do better. Last but not least, you can argue why private is better is because of the fact that it is still a personal mode of transport and it is not financially bad. So you can also argue why it's a good thing because at the end of the day, you can argue it's a status symbol. So I'm sure most of you in watching this probably have a family car. And if you do not, you can see how a car in Singapore could be used as a status symbol because in the olden days, or I would say back in my days, there was this thing called the 5 Cs, where a Singaporean is seen as successful if they manage to earn all these 5 Cs, which is cash, credit card, car, a condo, and a country club membership. So if all these five, you're considered very successful in Singapore. So you can still see how in the Singapore mindset, a car could be a status symbol, and hence why people still want the private transport of cars. Okay, so either or, both sides are good. Bear in mind, at the end of the day, you need to argue one side. So preferably, I would still argue for private actually and not public, for the very reasons of these and more. But to make your answer much more credible and with more qualitative, and if you refer to this part of your spoken interactions, right? How to show sustained discussion and moving beyond the prompts. This is where I throw in that word that I tell my students, an anecdote. So how do we throw in an anecdote? I will show you later when we look through the question in detail, okay? So remember, we're going to look out for this anecdote that we'll talk about later.